The Galactic Concordat had ruled the stars for 11,000 years. Every species that reached for the heavens found the Concordat waiting for them. The ancient races who had built this empire were patient. They had learned long ago that conquest through war was wasteful. There was a better way to build an empire that would last forever. They called it the chains. The chains were not made of metal or rope. They were not visible to the eye. They existed deep inside the mind, woven into the very thoughts of every species that joined the Concordat. When a new civilization developed space travel, the Concordat would come to them with gifts and promises. They offered medicine that cured all disease. They offered technology that could feed billions. They offered membership in a galactic community that stretched across 1,000,000 worlds. All they asked in return was a simple ceremony, a moment of connection, a binding that would ensure peace forever. The quantum encoders would hum, light would flash, and deep within the neural pathways of every member of that species, the chains would take hold. After that, certain things became impossible. Violence against higher caste species could not happen. Rebellion could not be imagined. Trade agreements were followed not because of law, but because breaking them caused physical pain. The chains made obedience as natural as breathing. For 11,000 years, this system worked perfectly. The Concordat grew, wars ended, trade flourished. The elder races who had created this system looked upon their work and felt pride. They had built something eternal, something perfect. Then they found Earth. Ambassador Sorrel of the was chosen to lead the first contact mission. They were the diplomatic caste of the Concordat. Their bodies were tall and slender, covered in scales that shifted color with their emotions. They had performed thousands of first contacts over the Sorrel herself had bound 47 species to the Concordat. She expected nothing different from the small blue world called Earth. The humans were primitive by galactic standards. They had only recently developed nuclear weapons and were taking their first steps into their own solar system. Their radio signals had reached Concordat listening posts just 50 years before. The analysis teams had studied them carefully. Humans were adaptable. They were resilient. They could survive in conditions that would kill most species. The Concordat saw great potential in them. Sorrel's ship descended through Earth's atmosphere on a spring morning. The humans had been contacted in advance and had prepared for the arrival. World leaders gathered at their United Nations building. Cameras broadcast the event to every corner of the planet. Billions watched as the silver ship landed and they emerged. Sorrel spoke words that she had spoken many times before. She told the humans about the Concordat. She showed them images of paradise worlds and gleaming cities. She promised them cures for their diseases, solutions to their poverty, and a place among the stars. The humans listened with wide eyes and hungry hearts. The ceremony took place on the steps of the great building. Millions gathered to watch. Sorrel activated the quantum encoders. They hummed with power that humans could not yet understand. Light flashed across the crowd. Every human on Earth felt a strange tingle pass through their minds. Sorrel smiled. She had felt the chains take hold 1,000 times. She knew the sensation of a species being bound. She reported to the conclave that the ceremony had been successful. Humanity was now part of the Concordat. The humans were assigned their place in the Great Order. Their physical strength and endurance made them useful for labor. Their adaptability meant they could work in environments that other species found dangerous. Within a year, human workers were being transported to mining stations and cargo ports across the sector. They worked hard. They followed orders. They seemed grateful for the opportunity. Sorrel returned to her regular duties. She had already forgotten the small blue world and its strange but useful inhabitants. Earth was just another success, another species brought into the fold. 3 years passed. On a cargo station orbiting a gas giant in the system, a human named worked alongside dozens of other laborers. They moved heavy containers from ships to storage bays. The work was hard and the hours were long. Their overseer was a Al named. The owl were the enforcer caste of the Concordat. They had 4 arms, hard shells covering their bodies, and mandibles that could crush bone. The chains made them absolutely loyal to the elder races. They enforced the rules with brutal efficiency, had overseen labor crews for decades. He had never encountered a problem he could not solve with threats or pain. On that day, decided that the human workers were moving too slowly. He grabbed a young woman named Sarah and threw her against a container. She fell hard and cried out in pain, raised his arm to strike her again. Stepped between them. This should not have been possible. The chains prevented lower caste species from opposing higher caste species. The neural programming should have frozen in place. He should have felt overwhelming fear and submission. His body should have refused to move. Instead, punched in the face. The owl's mandibles shattered. Blue blood sprayed across the deck, collapsed, screaming in pain and confusion. He had never been struck by a bound species. It was supposed to be impossible. Alarms screamed across 17 star systems. Monitoring stations that tracked the chains registered an impossible event. Emergency protocols activated. Reports flooded toward the conclave, each one marked with the highest priority. Something had gone terribly wrong. Within hours, investigators arrived at the station. They examined. They scanned his brain 100 different ways. They tested his neural pathways with every tool available. The results made no sense. The chains were not there. More humans were tested, then more, then thousands, then millions. The results were always the same. The quantum encoding had interfaced with human neural tissue during the ceremony 3 years ago. The encoders had registered success, but the chains had never actually taken hold. The programming had found nothing to bind to. Human minds had some quality, some fundamental difference that made them immune to the chains. Humanity had smiled and nodded during the ceremony. They had felt the tingle in their minds. They had assumed it was some kind of blessing or gift. They had gone out into the galaxy and worked hard because they wanted to, not because they were forced to. When they followed orders, it was by choice. When they were obedient, it was because they saw no reason not to be. They had never been bound at all. The conclave of elders met in emergency session for the first time in 2,000 years. The great chamber, carved from the heart of an ancient asteroid, filled with representatives from the highest castes. They were there in their flowing robes. The owls stood in their armor. The elder races themselves attended, beings so old that they had forgotten what it meant to walk among younger species. Ambassador Sorrel was recalled from her duties and made to stand before them all. Her scales flushed with shame as she explained what had happened on Earth. She had followed proper procedure. The encoders had shown success. There had been no sign that anything was wrong. The elders did not accept her excuses. She was stripped of her rank and sent away in disgrace. But removing Sorrel did not solve the problem. The problem was humanity itself. For the first time in 11,000 years, the Concordat faced a species they could not control. The news spread through the great halls and quiet chambers of the Concordat. Lower caste species heard whispers about the humans who could not be bound. Most dismissed it as rumor. The chains were eternal. The chains were perfect. Everyone knew this. But some began to wonder. Was imprisoned on the station for 72 days while the Concordat decided what to do with him. They could not execute him without admitting what had happened. They could not release him without showing weakness. In the end, they transferred him to a remote research facility where scientists tried again and again to make the chains work on human minds. They failed every time. Endured their tests with quiet patience. He did not fight. He did not resist. He simply refused to be what they wanted him to be. When they asked him why he had struck the owl overseer, he gave them a simple answer. He was hurting my friend, so I stopped him. The scientists did not understand. The chains were supposed to make such choices impossible. Loyalty to one's own kind was supposed to be less important than obedience to the higher castes. The fact that it acted on simple human compassion, without any programming to prevent it, frightened them more than open rebellion would have. They could deal with rebels. They had dealt with rebels before. The chains always won in the end. But how could they fight something that simply did not recognize their chains at all? As the decades passed, the Concordat tried everything. They developed new encoding techniques. They attempted neural restructuring. They proposed genetic modifications that would make future generations of humans compatible with the chains. Humanity submitted to each procedure with good humor and cooperation. Nothing worked. The chains slid off human minds like water off stone. No matter what the scientists tried, no matter what technology they developed, they could not make humans into proper subjects of the Concordat. And with each failure, the whispers grew louder. If the chains could fail with humans, could they fail with others? If one species could walk free, did the chains have to bind anyone at all? These were dangerous thoughts. The Concordat had been built on the assumption that the chains were unbreakable. That assumption was now crumbling, and no one knew what would rise from the ruins. 50 years had passed since the ceremony on Earth. Humanity had spread across dozens of star systems, working and living among the other species of the Concordat. They built families. They made friends. They learned the languages and customs of their alien neighbors, and everywhere they went, they brought something dangerous with them. Questions. The humans could not help it. It was simply how their minds worked. When they saw something that did not make sense, they asked about it. When they encountered a rule that seemed unfair, they wondered why it existed. When they watched their friends suffer, they wanted to know if things could be different. A human cargo pilot named Jennifer worked trade routes in the outer sectors. She hauled goods between stations and learned the business of interstellar commerce. She noticed that the OWL always received better prices for the same goods. She noticed that human traders were charged higher fees and given worse contracts. She asked her OWL business partner why this was the case. The OWL, whose name was, could not answer. He had never thought to question the trade agreements. The chains made it impossible for him to even consider that the system might be unfair. When Jennifer pressed him, he felt a strange pain in his head and had to end the conversation. But afterward, he could not stop thinking about her question. It sat in his mind like a splinter, irritating him day and night. Why were the agreements the way they were? He tried to dismiss the thought, but it kept returning. The chains were supposed to make such thinking impossible, but somehow, exposure to human questioning had planted something in his mind that the chains could not remove. Was not alone. Across the Concordat, aliens who worked closely with humans began experiencing similar symptoms. Thoughts they should not have been able to think. Questions they should not have been able to ask. The effect was slow and subtle, but it was spreading. Doctor was a philosopher at one of Earth's oldest universities. She had spent decades studying the structure of the Concordat and the nature of the chains. She had interviewed thousands of aliens and examined their neural programming with every tool available. She had also studied humans, trying to understand why their minds were immune. Her conclusion was published in a paper that spread across the galaxy like wildfire. She called it On the Nature of Imposed Harmony. The paper asked a simple question that should have been impossible to ask. What is peace if it is not chosen? The chains created order, Doctor wrote. They prevented war and enforced cooperation, but they did not create true peace. True peace came from beings who chose not to fight, who decided for themselves that cooperation was better than conflict. The chains removed that choice. They created obedience without understanding, harmony without love. This was not peace, Doctor argued. It was slavery with a prettier name. Her paper should have been suppressed. The Concordat controlled all communications in the galaxy. They could have blocked it easily. But somehow, copies kept appearing. Aliens who read it passed it to others. The chains prevented them from sharing forbidden ideas, but the paper did not trigger the usual responses. It was phrased so carefully, so gently, that the neural programming did not recognize it as dangerous until it was too late. On a library station at the edge of space, a crystalline being sat in a chamber filled with ancient records. Their name was, and they had served as an archivist for the Concordat for nearly 200 years. They had countless documents, organized millions of records, and never once questioned their purpose. Now they read Doctor's paper for the 7th time, and something inside them was changing. Had worked with human librarians for decades. They had shared meals and conversations and quiet moments among the shelves. The humans had asked them questions that no one else had ever asked. What was their favorite record? Did they ever wish they could write something themselves? Had they ever imagined being something other than an archivist? At first had not understood. They were an archivist. That was what they were. The chains defined their role, and the chains were absolute. But the questions had planted seeds, just as they had planted seeds in and thousands of others across the galaxy. Now those seeds were growing into something that could not be stopped. Put down Doctor's paper and walk to the center of the library station. Representatives of the conclave were present, conducting their regular inspection. The chief librarian, of high rank, was instructing on their next assignment. They were to travel to a distant sector and organize a new archive. It was an honor, the chief librarian explained. Should be grateful. Looked at the chief librarian and felt something they had never felt before. The chains were screaming in their mind, demanding obedience, threatening pain. But behind the screaming, there was a quiet voice that sounded almost human. "You can refuse." "I would like to decline this assignment," said. The words hung in the air. Everyone in the chamber froze. The chains should have made such refusal impossible, should have collapsed in agony the moment they tried to disobey. But they remained standing, their crystalline form glowing with an inner light that none of them had seen before. The chief librarian stared at them. "What did you say?" "I have been reading human poetry," said. Their voice was calm and steady. "I would like to write some of my own. I do not believe I require permission." The conclave representatives called for security. AL enforcers rushed into the chamber. They surrounded, weapons raised, waiting for the order to strike down this impossible rebel. But did not fight. They simply stood there, peaceful and unafraid, and let everyone see that the chains could be broken. The news spread faster than light. I had refused a direct order from a higher caste. They had not died. They had not collapsed. They had simply said no, and the universe had not ended. Other heard what had done. They felt something stir inside them, something that had been sleeping for 6,000 years. They began to ask questions of their own. They began to wonder if they, too, could refuse. The mining caste heard the news on their dark, mineral-rich worlds. They had dug ore from the ground for, feeding the factories and forges of the Concordat. They had never complained. They had never imagined anything different. Now they looked at each other and saw the same thought reflected in their eyes. What if we stopped? Human workers on 100 stations shared what they knew with their alien colleagues. They did not preach or demand. They simply talked about their own world, their own history, the times when their own people had been bound by chains of a different kind. They talked about how those chains had been broken. They talked about what it meant to be free. The chains were supposed to be eternal. They were supposed to be perfect. But they had a weakness that no one had ever discovered. They could prevent rebellion, but they could not prevent ideas. They could stop a hand from striking, but they could not stop a mind from wondering. And once a mind began to wonder, the chains began to weaken. Revolutions do not always begin with violence. Sometimes they begin with a question, asked quietly in a library by a being who had never questioned anything before. Sometimes they begin with a paper, written in simple words that somehow slip past every defense. Sometimes they begin when one person looks at another and says what everyone else has been afraid to say. The Concordat had ruled the stars for 11,000 years, but empires are not eternal. They only seem that way to those who live within them. Doctor continued to write, continued to compose poetry. Humans continued to ask questions that should not have been asked, and slowly, quietly, inevitably, the galaxy began to wake up. The chains were law, but more and more beings were learning to ignore them. The war of unchaining did not begin with a single battle. It began with 1,000 small acts of defiance scattered across 1,000,000 worlds. A miner who refused to enter a dangerous tunnel, a poet who published without permission, a diplomat who asked questions at the wrong moment. Each act alone meant little. Together, they formed a tide that could not be turned back. The conclave responded with force. They had no other choice. For 11,000 years, the chains had made enforcement almost unnecessary. Now they had to remember how to fight a war. The Al Dominion was mobilized. Fleets that had gathered dust for were activated. The enforcers spread across the galaxy, determined to crush the rebellion before it could grow. The humans had been expecting this. On Earth, preparations had been for decades. The first generation of humans who had lived among the stars had returned home with knowledge and warnings. They knew the Concordat would eventually try to destroy them. They had been planning for that day since through his famous punch. Human ships were not as elegant as the vessels of the Concordat. They were bulky, practical, built for endurance rather than beauty. But they were fast, and they were many, and they were crewed by beings who could not be controlled. When the Al fleet arrived at the edge of the Sol system, they found an armada waiting for them. The Battle of Jupiter lasted 3 days. Human ships darted between the moons, using the gas giant's radiation belts as cover. Al commanders tried to coordinate their forces, but their tactics were rigid, their responses predictable. They had never fought an enemy that could adapt. They had never faced opponents who chose to fight rather than being programmed to. The humans won. It was not an easy victory. Thousands died. Ships burned in the cold void. But when the battle was over, the Al fleet was broken and humanity still stood. The news raced across the galaxy. A bound species could not defeat an enforcer fleet. It was impossible. The chains were supposed to ensure that lower castes could never challenge higher ones. But humans were not bound, and they had proven that the impossible could happen. Other species took notice. They who had been quietly resisting for years now openly declared their independence. The miners stopped working on 100 worlds. Even some began to question whether the old order was worth saving. The Concordat fractured. Elder races who had slept awoke to find their empire crumbling. They had created the chains to ensure eternal peace. They could not understand why that peace was now turning to war. They debated endlessly in their ancient halls, seeking solutions that did not exist. Ambassador Sorrel, stripped of her rank but not her determination, watched the chaos unfold. She was old now, her scales faded to pale gray. She had spent 50 years in disgrace, blamed for the failure on Earth. But she had also spent those years thinking. She had talked to humans. She had read their histories and their philosophies. She had asked herself the question that Doctor had posed so long ago. What is peace if it is not chosen? Sorrel did not have an answer yet, but she was beginning to understand that the chains were not the answer either. The war spread across the galaxy. It was not a simple conflict between two sides. It was a web of alliances and betrayals, of species waking up and species fighting to stay asleep. The Al remained loyal to the old order, their chains too strong to break. Some joined the rebellion while others fought against it. They were divided between those who wanted freedom and those who feared what freedom might cost. Through it all, the humans fought and built and questioned. They did not try to conquer. They did not try to rule. They simply made space for others to choose their own paths. When they needed weapons, human factories built them. When they needed food, human ships carried it. When former enemies needed someone to mediate their disputes, human diplomat stepped forward. Did not live to see the end of the war. He died peacefully on Earth, surrounded by his children but his legacy lived on in every human who reached out a hand to an alien and said, "You do not have to be what they made you." 300 years after the ceremony on the steps of the United Nations, the final session of the old conclave convened. The ancient chamber was by war. Many seats were empty. The elder races looked upon what remained of their empire and finally accepted what they should have accepted long ago. The chains had failed. Ambassador Sorrel, ancient and bent but unbroken, stood before the assembly. She had been invited to speak by both sides, respected for her long journey from proud diplomat to humble seeker of truth. Her scales flickered with colors that none of them had seen before, colors that spoke of emotions the chains had never allowed. "We created the chains because we feared what free beings might choose," Sorrel said. Her voice was soft but carried to every corner of the chamber. "We saw the wars of the ancient past. We saw the suffering and the death. We decided that the only way to prevent such horrors was to remove the ability to choose." She paused, looking at the faces around her, some hostile, some curious, some hopeful. "The humans have shown us what we should have known," she continued. "Beings who cannot choose cannot truly be at peace. They can only be quiet." The Treaty of Unchaining took 40 years to negotiate. Every species had different needs, different fears, different hopes for what would come next. The process of removing the quantum limiters from 1,700 spacefaring species took another century. Some adaptations were easy. Others were painful beyond measure. There was chaos. Species that had been forcibly for suddenly had to learn how to resolve conflicts through choice rather than compulsion. Ancient grievances surfaced. Old hatreds awoke. There were wars, small and large, fought between peoples who had never been allowed to fight before. But they also learned. Slowly, painfully, they learned that conflict did not have to mean destruction. They learned to negotiate, to compromise, to find common ground. They learned that peace was not the absence of disagreement, but the presence of respect. The humans helped. They threw themselves into the work of building something new, just as they had thrown themselves into every challenge they had ever faced. Human mediators traveled to 1,000 worlds, helping former enemies become reluctant allies and then genuine friends. Human teachers shared their history, both the dark parts and the bright, showing that beings could rise above their worst impulses without chains to force them. A new concordat emerged from the ashes of the old. It was not perfect. It was messy and complicated and required constant work to maintain, but it was real, it was chosen, and that made all the difference. Doctor lived to see the first decade of the new order. Her paper was still read, still debated, still inspiring new generations to ask questions that had no easy answers. She died surrounded by students of a dozen species, all of them writing poetry and philosophy in languages she had helped them discover. Outlived everyone from those early days. Crystalline beings were nearly immortal and spent centuries composing works that celebrated the galaxy's new freedom. Their poems were simple but profound, written in the plain language they had learned from their human friends. "Choice is not easy," one poem began. "It is heavy and hard, but chains are heavier still." The granddaughter of became humanity's first official ambassador to the Reformed. Her name was Maya, and she kept her grandfather's worn work gloves in a case on her desk. When visitors asked about them, she would smile and tell the story of a cargo hauler who threw a punch that changed the universe. "To remember," she would say, "that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to believe you cannot." In the annals of galactic history, humans are not remembered as conquerors or warriors. They could be both when necessary, but that was not what made them special. They are remembered as the species that looked at unchallengeable law and said, with genuine confusion, "Why?" And in asking, gave the galaxy permission to wonder the same. The chains had been law. humans had ignored them. And in doing so, they had shown every being in the universe that laws are only eternal until someone chooses to change them. The stars shine down on a galaxy that is free. Not perfectly free, not easily free, but free nonetheless because a small species on a small blue world looked at the impossible and simply refused to believe it. That is the human way. That is how galaxies change.